Soldiers of Christ, arise and put your armor on. Strong in the strength which God supplies. Strong in the strength which God supplies through His beloved Son. Strong in the Lord of hosts and in His mighty power. Who in the strength of Jesus trust. Who in the strength of Jesus trust is more than conqueror. Standing in His great might with all His strength endued. But take to arm you for the fight. But take to arm you for the fight, the panoply of God. Leave no unguarded place, no weakness of the soul. Take every virtue, every grace. Take every virtue, every grace, and fortify the whole. That having all things done and all your conflicts past, you may o'ercome through Christ alone. You may o'ercome through Christ alone and stand entire at last.
It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. That's how Charles Dickens begins that classic story told usually about this time of the year, A Christmas Carol. I'm sure you remember it. The best of times, the worst of times. And that was the situation when the prophet Hosea was alive. He lived about 750 years before the birth of the Lord Jesus. During the reign of the last real king of the northern kingdom of Israel. You remember that after the death of Solomon, when Rehoboam, his son, came to the throne, the people came to him to ask him to relieve the burdens which Solomon in his later years had imposed upon the people. And Rehoboam rather arrogantly said, "My father whipped you with snares, but I will beat you with scorpions." He talked about making their burdens heavier. The outcome was, if you know your Old Testament history, that 10 tribes, the northern tribes, broke away from Judah and Jerusalem and established the northern kingdom. They made Jeroboam the first, Jeroboam a general, their king. And he sinned in that he introduced the worship of the Canaanite gods into the land. And there's not a single king from that time until the close of the kingdom who did not walk in the steps of Jeroboam. They all worshipped idols. Well, the king on the throne in the time of the prophet Hosea was Jeroboam the second. And it was indeed a time of great material prosperity, but it was at the same time a time of appalling idolatry, because the worship of the Baals, the masters, the owners, was common throughout the land. Now, the story of Hosea here is the story of a man who married a woman. By the way, his name in Hebrew, Hosea, means salvation. He married a woman named Gomer, and for a time they lived happily together. In fact, 3 sons were born to them. But then quite suddenly, for a reason that is not explained in the story, Gomer put on her finest clothes and she decked herself in her ornaments and she forsook her husband and went off with another man. Now, up to this point, I suppose it sounds like the all too familiar story of a broken marriage. But there's much more to it than that. We discovered that from this point, the course of Gomer's life was all downhill. And eventually news came to Hosea that told him where he thought his wife might be found. And he went in search of his wife. He discovered she'd sunk so low that she had become a prostitute and was wearing the heavily painted face that was common to that profession in those days. And in order to win his wife back, he had to pay the man who now owned her. She had become a slave. And he handed over the equivalent of 30 shekels of silver. In fact, he actually paid 15 silver shekels and a bag and a half of barley. It would almost seem that he wasn't a very wealthy man, and he had to harvest all his resources in order to raise the purchase price of her redemption. But such was the love that Hosea still had for this wife that he was anxious to have her back, in spite of the intense hurt she'd caused him. In spite of the harm she'd done herself, he was anxious, desperately anxious, for her to return. And just how deep that anxiety ran, just how great his love was, is shown in what he did. Under the circumstances, he could have divorced her according to the law of Moses, but he didn't do that. He might even have reported her to the priests and had her stoned to death as an adulteress. He didn't do that either. He might have insisted on serving the role of her master, her owner, and reminding her that she was his slave. He didn't do that either. Instead, Hosea said to his wife, "Look, to be your owner is not enough for me. I don't want that. I want you to come back to me. I want you to come back and we'll have a time of quietness in which you'll recover yourself. I won't make any demands upon you. There must be no running around and playing the harlot as you've done hitherto. I, for my part, as I say, will make no demands upon you. We'll live quietly together, and hopefully when you have recovered yourself, you'll no longer think of me as your master, your owner. You'll think of me as your husband again." Now, as all Bible students know, the book of the prophet Hosea has to be considered against the background of this very sad domestic tragedy in the life of this man. But it reflects the relationship that existed between God and Israel. And the expressions that constantly recur in this book are expressions that tell us that the nation had behaved like a harlot. She'd been unfaithful to the God who loved her, and yet in spite of everything, God wanted reconciliation with his people. God says, "Israel has deserted me. Israel has forgotten me. But I will speak tenderly to her." He uses the analogy of the marriage here. You remember that in Ephesians 5, Paul does the same thing when he talks about husbands loving their wives, even as Christ also loved the church. And he says, "This is a great mystery, but I speak with reference to Christ and the church." Well, this is God using the analogy of marriage between himself and Israel. And God says, "Look, I will woo her, I will win her, I will court her all over again as at the beginning. And she will respond to me as in those early days. And she won't call me any longer my Baal, my owner. She will be my husband and will make a new beginning." You read chapters 2 and 3. They are really moving chapters. Now, one of the criticisms leveled against the Bible by unbelievers and critics of all kinds has been that the God of the Old Testament is different from the God of the New Testament. And they want you to believe that while the God of the New Testament is a God of love, as revealed, for example, in John 3:16, that God so loved the world, the God of the Old Testament is very different. He's hard and cruel and vindictive and very remote. And almost on cue, they'll refer you to the fact that there was a time in the reign of King Saul when God commanded the extermination of all the Amalekites. And they'll triumphantly say, "Now there you got the God of the Old Testament. He's a cruel God." Well, it isn't my purpose this morning to try to defend the God of the Old Testament. That would be presumptuous on my part. Nor, on the other hand, Is it my desire to explain the action of God with regard to the Amalekites? Anyone who knows Old Testament history, anyone who knows the kind of people the Amalekites were in those days, will understand that God had very good reason for commanding the course of action that was taken. No, I'm going to point out to you that this is simply one of the ways in which the God of the Old Testament is criticized by the unbelievers. But I want to show you this morning, brethren, that there are aspects to the character of the God of the Old Testament which skeptics and unbelievers conveniently overlook and ignore. And I want you to see that in the book of Hosea, you have a book which preeminently reveals the tenderness and the compassion and the love of God. And it does that in a way that dispels instantly any suggestion of a difference between the God of the Old Testament and the God of the New Testament. In fact, it reveals that the God of the Old Testament is still a tender, caring Father and friend. And it's to verse 8 of that passage that was read to you that I want to draw your attention to. Just 6 words, as a matter of fact, at the beginning of the verse. How can I let you go? How can I let you go? God says there, how can I let you go? How can I hand you over? My compassion grows warm and tender. Now, put those words into the mouth of Hosea to begin with. Or, for that matter, put them into the mouth of any man or woman who has gone through the traumatic experience of the desertion of a loved one. And you instantly recognize that this is a cry of pain. How can I let you go? It's a cry of anguish. There are tears in those words. And you must hear the throb of anxiety and anguish in them. Well, put them into the mouth of God. Do they sound any different? When God says to His people, how can I let you go? Don't you hear the anguish in the voice of God? Can't you see that they glisten with the tears of a broken-hearted God? They express the way that God felt about Israel, a nation which has deserted Him, a nation which has been unfaithful to Him, a nation which in fact only deserves punishment from Him. And yet God doesn't turn His back on this wayward people. He regards Israel as a bride. And He can't desert Israel because He loves Israel. In spite of her infidelity, in spite of the way He's been treated, He cannot do it. And remember this, desertion was bad enough. Infidelity was the crowning hurt. Because whilst God's own altar was deserted, the people were flocking to the altars of the Baals, the owners, the masters who had been introduced into the land. Now, how can I let you go, God says? Does that sound like a hard, uncaring God? Of course not. He's still the warm, feeling, sensitive Father that He always was. And it means that God is just as loving and as caring over His true people, His new people today, as He ever was. Let me try to spell this out for you. Remember who you are. You are the new Israel. You are the true Israel. You are the spiritual people of God. You occupy the position in the economy of God today that Israel occupied in Old Testament times. You have been born into His family. You have become children of God in a way that no Jew could ever call himself a child of God. Oh yes, they believed in the fatherhood of God, but they believed in the fatherhood of God on a national basis. They believed that God was the father of the people. No Jew ever really considered God to be his personal father. But by virtue of the fact that you have been born of the Spirit, you have come into the family of God. And there exists between you and God a relationship that was closer than anything that ever existed between Israel of old and God in Old Testament times. And I want you to grasp this truth this morning, that God cares about you, that God says about you personally, how can I let you go? It's a rhetorical question. And a rhetorical question, as you know, is a question that doesn't call for an answer, because the answer is implicit in the question. How can I let you go? The answer is God cannot let you go. Now, of course, if in your studies of the prophets of the Old Testament, major or minor, it doesn't matter, all that you do is to gather knowledge and information, then, well, you'll derive little benefit from that study. And by the way, when you talk about the major and the minor prophets, you know very well we're not talking about the 5 major prophets that had important, serious messages, and 17 minor prophets who had messages that weren't as important. The distinction between the major and the minor prophets is not the importance of the message, it is simply the length of the books. They're simply called minor prophets because they wrote little books. They're called major prophets only because they wrote long messages. Please bear that in mind, and sort of don't disparage the minor prophets in comparison with Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel, because the minor prophets had major messages, and this is one of them. God says, listen, I'll never let you go. I will never let you down. I will never leave you alone. How can I let you go? Think about this for just a minute. God will never let you go. Please understand that. God will never let you go. One English writer described the love of God as the hound of heaven. The hound of heaven. And you know what we're talking about? It was describing the love of God as something that gets on your trail, that tracks you down, that holds on to you. It is persistent, it is relentless, and it won't ever lose sight of you. And that's a wonderful thought, isn't it? When you think about it, Hosea might very well have turned his back on this wayward wife. When somebody mentioned her name, he might have said, listen, I don't want to hear her name ever mentioned again. It is all over. It is all finished. I don't want to hear a thing about Gomer once again. But he didn't. Hosea went out and he looked for his wife in all the places of ill repute where fallen women were likely to be found. And why did he do it? He did it because in spite of everything, he loved her, and he still considered that she belonged to him. By the way, there may be a time when some of you present this morning felt that you belonged to the Lord, but you've left him. But let me tell you, he won't let you go. He still wants you back. And it may well be that some of you listening to me right now need that restoration to God that is depicted in the Scriptures. But he went out, as I say, and he found her. And in spite of all the hurt, all the pain, he loved her. He couldn't abandon her. Now, don't you find it tremendously comforting that God says, how can I let you go? How often have you heard of a mother steadfastly holding on to a wayward son, yes, some might even call him a worthless son, or a wife standing by a husband who time and time again has shown himself to be unreliable or unworthy, and nobody knows it better than she, and yet nothing in all the world will ever induce that woman to turn her back on him or close the door against him. No matter how often that son or that husband lets down the wife or the mother, it's always the same. No matter how much heartache, how much grief has been caused by the behavior, you say to the mother, why do you tolerate this? Why do you put up with it? Why do you let him do this to you? You say to the wife, why do you let him treat you like that? And, well, he's my son. He's my husband. I remember some people said to one father whose son had been in trouble all of his life, why do you put up with it? Why don't you turn him out? And the father responded, yes, you can all turn him out. Everybody except his own father. And there's a lovely French fable, and I emphasize that it is a fable, as you'll understand, but it's a very significant fable. It's about a woman and her son who had a very close relationship. They were extremely close together. But the son came under the influence of an older, worldly, wise, and wicked woman. He was infatuated by her, and gradually the gulf between himself and his mother widened, until one day this wicked woman said to him, "Look, I want you to prove your love for me by killing your mother and bring me her heart." A terrible thing to say. She was that kind of person. And the young man, in his infatuation, killed his own mother, and he cut out her heart. And as he was leaving the house with the heart in his hand, he stumbled and fell. And the heart fell out of his hand and rolled away. And the heart said, "Have you hurt yourself, my son?" We're talking about love. We're talking about the love that human beings can have for one another. But this is the love of God that we're talking about today. And regardless of the cost, God says, "How can I let you go?" We sang last Lord's Day, I believe it was, there were 99 that safely lay in the shelter of the fold. That was written about 134 years ago by Elizabeth Clephane. She wrote it after hearing D.L. Moody preach a sermon on the story of the Good Shepherd. He went out looking for his lost sheep. And Ira Sankey, the man who always sang with Moody, put the words to music. And I love the verse that says, "And none of the ransomed ever knew how deep were the waters crossed, or how dark was the night that the Lord went through, ere he found his sheep that was lost." God will never let you go. And he'll never let you alone. Have you ever experienced loneliness? You know what loneliness really means? Some years ago the Beatles wrote a song, I think, which touched many a heart. All those lonely people it spoke about. And there are many lonely people in the world. I remember reading some time ago in my English newspaper of one woman who was found dead in her home. She had never been visited, and people didn't know that she needed help, or at least they said they didn't know that she needed help. But they found her diary. Would you believe it? They found her diary. And for almost a month, almost for 30 days, there was only one entry, day after day. Nobody came. Nobody came. Nobody came. Loneliness. Now, of course, I suppose older people know what it is to be lonely. Some of you present in this congregation know what it is to lose a partner. You know what it means to have long days and lonely nights. And very often, you know, we're not as sensitive to the needs of these people as we ought to be. I'm so glad that I see that you're arranging a new visitation program. It's a great thing. A church needs to have that kind of program, because sometimes we'll have in our congregations people, as I say, who have lost a partner, a husband or a wife, and it's easy to forget their needs. Sometimes when they have their own children, their children are so busy with their own family life, with their own profession, their own job, so taken up by the countless number of things that crowd in upon their lives, and mother, or perhaps even father, sometimes gets pushed to the background or forgotten. But these lonely people don't blame you. They'll even turn around and say, "Well, you know, he's got a family of his own to look after now, and he's kept so busy." But there are other people who get bitter about it. Sometimes they say, well, they push you into the backwater, and they don't want to know about you once you get old, once you get alone. Well, the Lord's not like that. The Lord loves you. In fact, we have the word, "I will never leave you, no, nor in any wise forsake you." We sing a hymn, "The soul that to Jesus is turned for repose will find that he'll never surrender them to their foes." And that's true, isn't it? That if you turn to Jesus, he never lets you alone. And if that's not enough, Jesus says, "I am with you always, even to the end of the age." That's Matthew 28, you remember, verse 20, the end of the Great Commission. And you know that was the verse that sustained David Livingstone in Africa. Do you know that for 8 years, the last 8 years of the life of that great missionary, he never saw the face of a white man, and he was racked with malaria and dysentery, bleeding constantly from internal hemorrhage, in unremitting pain for the whole of 8 years. But in his loneliness, in his diary, he records his reading of the Great Commission in Matthew 28 and verse 20. And he read the words, "I am with you always, even to the end of the age." And Livingstone's own written observation on that verse is, "This is the word of a perfect gentleman, and it's good enough for me." Paul had the same experience. In prison at Rome, he says, "At my first defense, no man stood by me, all men forsook me. I pray that God will not lay this to their charge, but the Lord stood by me." The Lord didn't leave him alone. That's in 2 Timothy 4, verses 16 and 17. The Lord will never leave you alone. And coupled with that is the thought that He'll never let you down. He'll never let you down. He will never let you go. He will never leave you alone. He will never let you down. If you go to Deuteronomy 31 and verse 8, you find the words that God spoke first to Israel, or rather Moses spoke first to Israel, and then to Joshua. Moses was aware of being about to die, recognizing that he had to pass on the torch to somebody else. And he says to Joshua, "It is the Lord who will go before you. He will be with you. He will not fail you nor forsake you." Now that's not a word just to Joshua, because you come over to the New Testament, you come to Hebrews 13, verses 5 and 6, and you find the same promise repeated and presented to the church. In fact, in the Greek text, it is very emphatic. A literal translation of the Greek says, "In no wise thee will I leave, in no wise thee will I forsake." The emphasis is on the word thee. "In no wise thee will I leave, in no wise thee will I forsake." Now that's the promise of the church. Not just to Israel, it's your promise. And I suppose we all know what it means to be let down. I don't suppose there's anyone who has not at some time or another, and if it's not happened yet, it will happen, believe me. We all experience this. It's the common experience of humanity. And as a matter of fact, I suppose that in the down-letting business, we've been at both ends. We've not only been let down ourselves, let's face the reality. Let's be honest with ourselves. Sometimes we've let other people down. We know what it is to be let down. We know what it is to let other people down. And that's because we're just human beings. We have our failings and our weaknesses. And it's a reason not to expect too much of each other, but to make allowances for each other in a way that we don't always do. But here is a friend who sticks closer than a brother and who will never let you down. In fact, in Psalm 27 verse 10, the psalmist says, "When my father and mother forsake me, then the Lord will take me up." Forsaken my father and mother? You say, is that possible? Well, what have you been reading recently? Haven't you read it in your newspaper? The way that some parents have been able to treat their children, and it's even worse than that. I know we're living in a fallen world, but sometimes it's terrible. But God Himself asks on one occasion, "Can a nursing mother forget her child?" And He answers His own question. This is Psalm 49:15. "Yes, she may forget, yet I will not forget you." Not Psalm, it's Isaiah 49:15. Isaiah 49:15. Can a nursing mother forget her child? God says, yes, she may forget, but I will not forget you. Think about that. A nursing mother. Is there ever a time in human life when a mother is closer to her child, her baby, than when she's nursing? But even then, God says it's possible that in a fallen world, it can happen that a nursing mother forgets her baby, neglects her baby. But God says, I won't neglect you. Now, this congregation, and I'm not going to say much about this because at a more appropriate time, more will be said. This congregation is now enduring the loss of Brother Joe Sasser. We're feeling very greatly the suddenness of his passing, because we all felt he was getting better. Well, it's even cast a shadow over the service, hasn't it, right from the very beginning? You'll agree with that. But the reality is that we should be very careful in our grief. Let our grief be directed towards Jovita, because she needs your care and your love and your concern as never before in her life. And then you may grieve a little bit for the congregation, for the fact that the eldership has lost a man who cooperated greatly, a man whose Christian character, a man whose tremendous ability will be sorely missed in this church. But don't grieve for him. What could be more fitting than for a shepherd to go to meet the chief shepherd? Last Lord's Day, from this very spot, I talked to you about heaven. I told you what I think about it. But he knows. I talked about it. He's experiencing it. I talked about our hope of seeing Jesus as he is and being like him. Joseph is experiencing that now. You and I tonight, if the weather brightens up a little bit, almost English, you and I tonight may see the beautiful sunset. You will never see another sunset because morning has broken. I like the little bit in Pilgrim's Progress where Mr. Christian gets to the great river that separates him from the beautiful city beyond. And after gathering his courage together, he plunges into the water and he crosses over. And all the trumpets sounded on the other side. Can't you hear the trumpets? God's purpose in the life of Joe Sasser has been realized. He's at home with the Lord. And for that reason, do not allow for one moment the thought that what has taken place to reflect in any way on the loving concern about which I've spoken this morning. Has God let either Joe or Jovita slip out of his hands? Of course not. They're still in the grip of the Lord. Jesus says in John 10:27-28, "My sheep hear my voice, and they follow me, and I give unto them eternal life. They shall never perish, neither shall any man pluck them out of my hand. My Father who gave them to me is greater than all, and no man can pluck them out of my Father's hand." Never perish. Can it be true? Of course it can, because God says, "How can I let you go?" So long as you want to stay in the hand of God, He'll take care of you. So let me say that every promise that God ever made, He can and He will keep. Does He promise forgiveness? Has He promised you strength for the day? Has He promised you support? Has He promised you unfailing supply? Does He promise you victory at the end? Then you can depend upon Him. Because all the promises of God find their yes in Christ, says Paul in 2 Corinthians 1 and verse 20. So when you think about the love of God, think of it, though so tenderly and so touchingly shown in Hosea, as one of the great eternal facts of life. God will never let you go. This is the guarantee of your safety, so long as you want to stay in His hand. God will never leave you alone. You've got the promise of His constant friendship and companionship. And God will never let you go, or never let you down. You've got the promise of His concern and care in all the problems, all the difficulties that crowd in upon your life. I suppose we've all got problems. There's a Spanish proverb that says there is no home without its shh. And that's true. But let me tell you that His eye is on you. His eye is on you. His love is over you. His arms are around you. And He says, how can I let you go? Some of you today need to come. Some of you may have enjoyed the love and the care of God, and you're no longer in fellowship with God's people. Isn't it time you came home? Some of you have not yet obeyed the gospel. You've not surrendered your lives to Jesus. Isn't it time you came? And if you come, He won't let you go. Let's stand to sing the hymn that's been chosen.
Each day I'll do a golden deed, by helping those who are in need. My life on earth is but a span, and so I'll do the best I can.
Life's evening sun is sinking low. A few more days, and I must go to meet the deeds that I have done, where there will be no setting sun. To be a child of God each day, my light must shine along the way. I'll sing His praise while ages roll, and strive to help some troubled soul. Life's evening sun
is
sinking low.
A
few more days,
and
I must go
to meet the deeds that I have done, where there will be no setting sun. The only life that will endure is one that's kind and good and pure. And so for God, I'll take my stand. Each day I'll lend a helping hand.
Life's evening sun
is
sinking low. A few more days, and I must go
to meet the deeds that I have done, where there will be no setting sun. I'll help someone in time of need, and journey on with rapid speed. I'll help the sick and poor and weak, and words of kindness to them speak.
Life's evening sun is sinking low. A few more days, and I must go
to meet the deeds that I have done, where there will be no setting sun. While going down life's weary road, I'll try to lift some traveler's load. I'll try to turn the night to day, make flowers bloom along the way.
Life's evening sun is sinking low. A few more days, and I must go
to meet the deeds that I have done, where there will be no setting sun. Would you be free from the burden of sin? There's power in the blood, Would you or evil a victory win? There's wonderful power in the blood. There is power, wonder-working power in the blood of the Lamb. There is power, wonder-working power in the precious blood of the Lamb.
Would you be free from your passion and pride? There's power in the blood, power in the blood. Come for a cleansing to Calvary's tide. There's wonderful power in the blood. There is power, wonder-working power in the blood of the Lamb. There is power, wonder-working power in the precious blood of the Lamb. Would you be whiter, much whiter than snow? There's power in the blood, power in the blood. Sin stains are lost in its life-giving flow. There's wonderful power in the blood. There is power, wonder-working power in the blood of the Lamb. There is power, wonder-working power in the precious blood of the Lamb. Would you do service for Jesus your King? There's power in the blood, power in the blood. Would you live daily his praises to sing? There's wonderful power in the blood. There is power, wonder-working power in the blood of the Lamb. There is power, wonder-working power in the precious blood of the Lamb.